Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy and you're welcome to the series of lessons dedicated to the importance of the center in chess. So there are 64 squares on the chessboard and central squares d4, d5, e4 and e5 have a special importance. So our task in this first lesson is to understand why. For this purpose, let's have a look how different pieces behave in the center. We start with the bishop. In this particular case, it occupies the position in the corner of the board. Let's have a look how many squares this bishop controls. It controls actually 7 squares on the initial diagonal a1, h8. So they are b2, c3, d4, e5, f6, g7, and h8. And now let's have a look what happens if this bishop goes to the center. For instance, bishop goes to d4. We can see that it still controls same quantity of squares on the initial diagonal. They are a1, b2, c3, e5, f6, g7, and h8. And now it controls a new diagonal g1, a7. So it controls additionally 6 squares. So g1, f2, e3, c5, b6, and a7. So we can see that in the corner position, this bishop controlled only 7 squares. Now it controls 7 plus 6, so 13 squares. Is it really important? Definitely yes, because the more squares the piece controls, the more powerful it becomes. So the bishop became almost twice as powerful if compared to the corner position. Very nice result. Let's have a look on other pieces. We continue with the queen, the most powerful piece in chess because it combines features of the rook and the bishop. So in the position that we see on the board, it controls 7 squares on the diagonal a1, h8, b2, c3, d4, e5, f6, g7, and h8. At the same time, it controls the squares that could be controlled by the rook in the same position. So they are squares on the a file. A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, and A8, and the squares on the first rank, they are B1, C1, D1, E1, F1, G1, and H1. So 7 squares on the diagonal, 7 squares on the A file, and 7 squares on the first rank, which means 21 squares. So let's have a look what happens if the queen goes to the center, again to d4 square. So still same quantity of squares on the d file and now the first rank, so 7 plus 7, 13. And also same quantity of squares on the initial diagonal a1, h8. And now, just like the bishop, it controls additionally 6 squares on the new diagonal g1, a7, which became possible to control after moving to the center. They are g1, f2, e3, c5, b6, and a7. So now queen controls 21 plus 6, 27 squares, which is not that great improvement of the power of the queen, of course, because the queen was initially very, very powerful, but still his power increased, which is a great result of the centralization. So 27 squares, absolute maximum of the control in chess. Let's have a look on other pieces. Now we talk about the knight. In the corner position, it controls only 2 squares, so very bad result, actually very low power of the knight in the corner of the board. That's why there is a golden rule not to put the knight in the corner of the board or somewhere on the edge of the board, because there the knight controls only a few squares. It is very bad. So let's have a look what happens if this knight goes to the center. Let's say knight c2 and then to d4. So 2 moves to get to the center, and now let's count. The squares this knight controls are c6, b5, b3, c2, e2, f3, f5, and e6, which means 8 squares. So just compare 2 squares in the corner and 8 squares in the center. The knight became 4 times more powerful than in the corner of the board. Just a dramatic increase in the power. Let's have a look on other pieces. We continue with the rook, and we can see that the rook in the initial position controls 7 squares on the a file and 7 squares on the first rank. So 14 squares. And if it goes to the center, nothing really changes in this sense. So being placed in the center, it still controls 7 squares on the file. Now it is a d file, and 7 squares on the rank, so nothing changes for the rook, at least on the empty board, which means for the rook, it is not that principle to be centralized to increase the power, right? So everything depends on whether the file is open or not, and actually this makes the rook powerful or not. So the rook is the first exception if compared to other pieces. Now let's have a look on the king. The king is a very special piece in chess because for a long time it remains passive. It is very important to just protect the king because there is a great threat of being checkmated, and only in the endgame stage when a lot of pieces are being exchanged, so the threat of a checkmate is not that critical, the king can be activated, and usually there is a golden rule of centralizing the king, so the king goes to the center. So let's have a look why it is important. In the corner position, of course, the king controls only a few squares. They are a2, b2, b1 in this particular case, so only 3 squares. But once the king goes further, for example, to b2, it starts controlling absolute maximum of squares. So it controls 8 squares now, just like the knight in the center, but the king is placed only on b2, not in the center position. So let's have a look what happens when it goes to the center. Let's say king c3, king d4, and we can see again that nothing really changes. So still only 8 squares. So the king controls only adjacent squares. It can occupy only adjacent squares according to the rules of chess, and also to attack something it has to occupy adjacent square to the object of attack. So why the central position is so important for the king? Because usually in the endgame stage, we have pawns on different flanks, and it is not that easy to understand from the very start where the king will be needed. So on which side it should go to attack, because in the majority of cases, when the endgame stage starts, there are no serious weaknesses, and only when the weakness arises somewhere, the king could be maneuvered there, and this will be efficient just to attack that weakness. So why central position is so important? Because exactly from central position, the king can get to both sides with almost the same quantity of moves. So whenever this king is needed, for example, on the queen side or on the king side, this king is here to get there quite quick if compared to any other square of the board, right? That's the point of the centralization. So the king goes to the center to be ready to get anywhere on the board. So in addition to the feature of making almost any piece much more powerful if compared to any other position, central position is quite flexible. So the same is true not only for the king, so almost any other piece being placed in the center has a chance to get to both flanks quite fast. That's the point. So we have actually two main reasons for centralization in chess, and two main reasons to value central squares much more than any other square on the board. The first reason, central position makes almost all your pieces much more powerful. Second reason, you have an access to both flanks with the same quantity of moves, so with the same time. If central squares are so important, if they are so promising, the question is why not to occupy these squares with the pieces from the very start of the game. So let's have a look if it is possible and whether it is a good idea. For example, white starts the game with the help of the knight move. So knight goes to f3, black plays d5, and knight goes to e5. So as you can see from the initial position, it is possible to get to the center with the knight, spending only 2 moves. Very good result. And now everything looks just fantastic for white because the knight occupies the best possible position in the center, controlling 8 squares and exerting pressure on black's position as well. But it is not that good in fact, because black simply plays f6. We can see that the pawn already attacks the knight. Everybody knows that the pawn is less valuable than the knight, so to allow the pawn to take the knight will be an extremely stupid idea. Of course, so to save the material here, the knight should go away. And when the knight goes away, black continues with the e5, and we can see the result. White actually achieved nothing. So this early centralization completely failed. Instead of occupying central position, the knight now occupies f3 position, which is not that great. And what is more importantly, black managed to occupy the center heavily with pawns. And we didn't discuss the result of centralization of pawns, because for pawn, it is not that important to be in the center or not in the center in the sense of controlling squares. So in any position, the pawn controls usually only 2 squares. But when there are a lot of pawns in the center, as we can see, these pawns work together, they control a lot of important squares. So as you can see, c4, e4, d4, and f4 in this particular case. Pawn e5 is protected by pawn f6. Pawn d5 can be protected by black's pieces, or, for example, again with the pawn. So this is kind of very solid pawn formation in the center. These pawns, especially e5 and d5, occupy central squares already. And all this means white lost a control over position. White lost an access to majority of important squares in this situation. So e5 and d5 are not accessible for white's pieces for the rest of the game, maybe. Squares like c4, d4, e4, f4 are also very hard to occupy in the future fight. So this means black simply has much more control over position, much more space. And it is a very bad situation. So remember, never allow your opponent to occupy the center with pawns so heavily like here. Another problem with this early centralization of the knight is that white spent a lot of time for nothing, because no result, right? Knight occupies f3 position, not a central one. So knight occupies only an f3 position. So that's why the idea of the early centralization of your pieces is not that great, which also means to occupy central square, you need a much better control over this square. That's why it makes sense to delay the centralization of your pieces, means occupation of central squares, and to start with the controlling the center with pieces and with pawns. Almost every popular opening setup serves to this purpose. Just for instance, if white starts the game with the help of e4, so we can see that pawn occupies central square and at the same time controls another central square, d5. Let's say black plays e5 and black actually does the same. So e5 is a central square, so this pawn occupies it and prevents white pieces from occupying this square, and at the same time controls d4 square. So the next stage is to try to fight with this pawn. So typically white plays f3, attacking e5, black protects this pawn, and again we can see that both knights are trying to control central squares. So knight attacks central e5 pawn and controls d4. Black does the same in the sense of controlling d4 and also protects e5 pawn. So the next stage will be to try to do something with the e4 pawn, so probably the knight will go to f6 and so on. So as you can see, both sides combine the ideas of development of the pieces and controlling central squares. So to occupy central squares, you need a much better control usually than you have in the initial position. That's the point. So this concludes the first lesson of the series, in which we understood the reasons why central squares are so special on the chessboard. Thanks for your attention. See you next lessons.